This is the second part of lecture 3, focusing on Bible geography, and I'm using a PowerPoint that we were using in the first part of this lecture. And I just want to make 2 notes real quickly. Number one, I find myself in a coffee shop in Fairmont, Minnesota, where I'm preaching, and so I needed to find some internet, and I think this will work well. If there's a little ambient noise, I trust it won't be a distraction. And secondly, again, there is a great deal of repetition here, a significant amount of repetition with what we dealt with in the first lecture, which was the second lecture, actually, but the first substantive lecture, which was 7 concepts. But it's all important material, and there are some very helpful slides and so on. I'm using a PowerPoint that was basically put together by my friend Todd Boland. And so I think it'll be helpful. And I want you, again, the notes that you have, the printed notes, this material is there, but the lecture, the PowerPoint doesn't actually follow those notes. So you might want to be taking notes along the way. These are important concepts that are going to be basic to the study that we're going to be doing in Israel. So I ask you to stay with me. We'll be rather quick. The focus here is the location and then the land. We've talked about this, but Israel, of course, in the Eastern Mediterranean world, very, very important is this concept of the Fertile Crescent that stretches from the Mesopotamia, which is between the rivers, the Tigris River to the north and the Euphrates River to the south here, and this area between is Babylon. I'm sorry, where the Babylonians were, is Mesopotamia, stretching across, avoiding the desert in the south, the mountains in the north, and of course being funneled into Little Israel. So the line here, the sort of purple line, is tracing the travel of Abram in Genesis when he was called out of Ur of the Chaldees. It's suggesting a spot. We don't know for sure for Ur of the Chaldees. But again, he makes his way, and of course he stops in Haran, which demonstrates he's not cutting across the desert. He is, in fact, following the crescent, which you must do. All right, so I leave that alone. The familiar concept here is a map that tries to sort of position Israel, Canaan, amidst the nations of the world. And take just a moment, focus on this. Again, the Arabian Desert, which thrusts up into the underbelly of the Fertile Crescent, and then these mountains to the north, which are virtually impassable. But notice some of the peoples. Again, here's Canaan. On the south and western end, down to the south, of course, is Egypt. Upper and lower Egypt, defined by the Nile River. Egypt is what she is because of this river, this ribbon of life called the Nile River. Remember that the Red Sea here to the south has 2 fingers, and you have the Gulf of Suez here and the Gulf of Aqaba here. And between them is traditional Mount Sinai. And then, of course, Israel today has a southern border that reaches down there to the Gulf of Aqaba to give her access to the Red Sea and the Sea of China and so on. So Little Israel to the west and south is Egypt, always her besetting sin. To the north is Syria. Syria is always to the north, sometimes called Aram, or the one of the Aramite peoples were the Syrians. Capital at Damascus. So as you make your way from Egypt, for instance, up through the land of Israel on the international highway, which is the Fertile Crescent, where the next stop is going to be Damascus, just to the north, primary capital of Syria, especially in the Old Testament. To the east of Syria, this area right here, we don't have it, but Tyre and Sidon, is Phoenicia. So remember, the Phoenicians are the people from whom David and Solomon bring the building materials for their palaces and the temple and so on. Hiram, king of, so Phoenicia is just to the north. As you make your way across the Fertile Crescent, you're going to come to the area of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, again, is specifically the area between the Tigris to the north and the Euphrates to the south. And might I say, and this map makes the point, there will be other maps as well, but the Euphrates River continues all the way up to the north here and close to the Mediterranean Sea. And when God promises Abraham all the land, he says from the great river to the river of Egypt, and all of this land, including what is today Syria and Lebanon, in antiquity Syria and Phoenicia and so on, really is part of that which was vouchsafed and will one day be possessed, I believe, by national Israel, redeemed national Israel. But anyway, the point is in Mesopotamia here, not the point so much, but here you have Babylon and the Chaldeans. And the Chaldeans are nestled there in Mesopotamia. The Chaldeans, of course, the Babylonians are going to conquer Israel in the late 7th century, 606 to begin with. Now again, then you have Assyria. Now, Assyria was that nation which ruled the Eastern Mediterranean world before Babylon. Their capital was Nineveh. They were a horribly cruel people. Nineveh is the city to which Jonah was dispatched and cried out and brought them to repentance, remember? So, and then you had further south and east is Persia. Actually, the order is this. Egypt is the first empire. She's not so much an empire, but she is the nation which controls the Eastern Mediterranean world, this into the Mediterranean world, as we open the pages of the Old Testament in the days of Abraham, in the patriarchal days. She is going to be displaced by Assyria, and Assyria is going to dominate the Eastern Mediterranean world for about 400 years. And then Assyria is going to be displaced by the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, very shortly, but it's the Chaldeans who are going to carry off the southern kingdom. Remember, Assyria carries off the northern kingdom in 722, but the Chaldeans carry off the southern kingdom in 606 to 586, but that kingdom lasts a very short while, and then they are displaced by the Persians. Actually, the Medians and the Persians, the Medes, I should say, the Medes and the Persians, and they rise up again. Babylon, destroy it. That's Daniel chapter 5, the handwriting on the wall. And then Persia becomes dominant. And of course, as we close the pages of the Old Testament, Israel has become a province under the heel of Persian dominion with a governor by the name of Nehemiah. So those are the nations that play into the biblical account very, very importantly, and just to sort of position them. You ought to have that in your head. Again, Mesopotamia is really where the Chaldeans are. To the east and south are the Persians, the Medians, to the east are the Assyrians, and so on. All right, here's another rather simpler map that does some of the same thing. The Amorites, by the way, that's sort of a generic name that almost is parallel. It's synonymous to the Canaanites. Sometimes the Canaanites, those tribes which specifically are living in the land which is to be given to Israel, or the Canaanites, sometimes called the Amorites. But again, you get a simpler map. Here's another map that spend a moment with it. I want you to concentrate on it for a minute, because there are some helpful elements of the setting of Israel. Again, here is Canaan. And this is just a strip of land from basically, here's the Sea of Galilee, here's the Dead Sea. So this is Israel. Again, this entire area, we mentioned this last time, is called the Levant. That's a geographic term, just talks about this region that's not a people, although the people who live here are sometimes called Levantines, but it's just a generic name. To the south is Egypt, Upper Egypt, which has Ramses, which becomes Avaris, which I think is where Goshen, where the Israelites settled. Lower Egypt is with the Valley of the Kings and so on. But again, Egypt is totally desert except for the Nile River. That's what gives it life. Here again is the Gulf of Suez. As we talked about here is the Gulf of Aqaba. Can't read that, but you make the point. I make the point that, and in between, of course, the traditional Sinai Peninsula. Notice as we go along the Fertile Crescent here to the east of the Jordan Rift of Israel, you'll find these very important, the Edomites. Now the Edomites are the descendants of Esau, and they settle down south of the Dead Sea. They're a basically desert people, very influential in guarding the spice trade that comes up from the south and so on from Arabia. The Edomites become the Idumeans in the New Testament. It's just a corruption of the name, and they actually move up and settle further north. Well, they're also down here. There's the city of Petra just to the south, the Sea of Dead Sea, which Edomite city in the New Testament era. So the Edomites, and of course the most important or familiar Edomite is Herod the Great, the Idumean, this son of Esau, who was in fact given rule over the people of Israel, New Testament. So you have Edom, and then you have the two brothers, Moab and Ammon, these two sons of Job by his two daughters. And the Moabites and the Ammonites are cousins. Remember that David's Ruth, of course, who's going to, from her is going to spring ultimately. David is a Moabite. So now again, to the north, you have Damascus, which is the capital, we think of it, of Syria, or here, Aram. And then as you make your way across the Fertile Crescent, you're going to come down into Mesopotamia, and here is the city of Babylon and the Babylonian people. And once again, the Assyrians to the east of Mesopotamia, basically the Persians a little further south, their capital at Susa, and the Assyrian capital, of course, at Nineveh. So again, same story, different map, but all of those are very, very important. They're the nations and the peoples who interact with Israel so dramatically throughout the Old Testament, and the geography is always important. So, now again, we have talked about this. I just mentioned it, but once again, the Fertile Crescent, I'm going to say it again, Fertile Crescent. I know this by heart. The Fertile Crescent is defined as a sickle of land, sickle in its shape, which stretches from Egypt on the south to Mesopotamia on the east. Egypt on the south and west to Mesopotamia on the east. And what's important is that it is land, the Fertile Crescent is land, which can be, I like to say, which can be cultivated, which can be traveled, and which can be, I didn't mean to do that, traveled, and which can be settled. Now, the important thing is it's land which can be cultivated, traveled, and settled, but it's surrounded on all sides by terrain where none of that's possible. The desert here, the mountains here, the sea here. So again, the Fertile Crescent becomes, and that's what's being represented here, a land bridge. Those two concepts of, number one, the land bridge. It is the bridge that gets you from Egypt to Mesopotamia. And secondly, it's often called the land between. That is, Israel's the land between. You have to pass through this little seemingly unimportant, but unspeakably important land, unimportant in terms of its lack of defenses and its lack of natural resources, but on the other hand, hugely important because you have to pass through this land. The traffic is going to be funneled into that land. And we talked a great deal about this. This is what I call the principle of providential placement in the last lecture, that God shaped the world so that the caravans would be coming through here, and they would hear these stories and carry them to the end of the earth. I know I've said it before, but it's so big. I want to make sure you have it before we get there. Now, this map, it's helpful, though it's a little hard to see, but what's distinctive here are the trade routes. These are the ancient trade routes. And I want you to see that the primary routes make their way up through the Fertile Crescent, through the Mesopotamia, and across the Crescent and down. And that's the primary route. Now, there is depicted here a route that crosses directly across the desert. There was, and there were way stations along the way and so on. But this is for either camel caravans or small groups. I mentioned this before, but this is undoubtedly the route that General Nebuchadnezzar took when he was in the region of Jerusalem after destroying the Assyrians up at a place called Carchemish in 609 BC. He had come down and was putting under tribute to himself these various lands, these various peoples and so on, came to Jerusalem. Some dispute as to exactly whether he had set off for Egypt, but at any rate, he heard that his father had died, and so he took a few young trainees and hostages, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and so on, from Jerusalem and others, And he made his way straight across the desert because he had to get back to Babylon to establish himself on the throne. So you do have a route, but it's not a major route. And even that, by the way, is going to be funneled, if you're coming from east to west, it's going to be funneled necessarily through Israel, because it's going to come to Damascus and then it wants to get down to Egypt. So at any case, what the important point to be made here is that the traffic, by reason of the geography, is going to be funneled into Israel. And they're going to make their way through this little tiny land right here. And as they do, they're going to hear the stories of God. There's one other route here that's helpful, and that's this spice trade route that's coming up from Arabia to the south. And it may make its way over here to Egypt, but this is what's going to become important, because one of the major shipping areas or ports was Tyre, and this spice route would make its way right through Israel and then up to Tyre. And this is one of the very important dynamics behind Herod's harbor in Caesarea Maritima. Herod the Great, for a number of reasons, built this remarkable harbor, first man-made harbor in human history, here in Caesarea. It's not on the map, but right about here. And in so doing, he captures that spice route, which is hugely, hugely important. And he is able to profit from the spice trade route. So I say, let's just make the point that, one other dynamic here that you can see is, in fact, this trunk of the highway right here, and that is the King's Highway. We've talked about this before, that as you came down, and especially if you're making your route directly across, but there was traffic that came down from the Fertile Crescent as it made its way down through Damascus, because it did come down through Damascus. It could take this eastern trunk that stayed on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and then make its way over to Egypt now. And Petra was a very important stop along the way there, a fortified stop. Now the point is that, number one, you're skirting the desert, and the desert is where all this over here, of course, is desert. The desert is where robbers are hiding out. They know the sands. They have these camel armies. They can fall upon you and then be gone in a moment. So it's a dangerous route. And furthermore, there are tributaries that flow into the Jordan system from the east, and the Zered and the Arnot and these tributaries are huge canyons that you have to make your way around. So the highway is rather forced to the east to avoid those tributaries, so they don't have to make their way down into the Zered Canyon and back out and so on. And again, it leaves them rather exposed. So I make the point that although there was a eastern trunk to the to that international highway, it was less and less used, and this Via Maris, as it's called, the trunk, the part of the highway that makes its way down around the Sea of Galilee and then follows along the coast here down to Egypt, was much more used. All right, all of that's review, but these maps are good, and I want you to get it nailed down in your head. Everything else I think we've talked about. There's the map that we've used in the past, very helpful map of the Fertile Crescent, as it were. All right, as to the physical geography, Israel is remarkably small. God gives us a couple of examples here in comparison to California. It's interesting to me that, especially here, I find myself in the upper Midwest, that you can put all of Israel in Lake Michigan. It is the dynamic, and this is a basic dimension north to south from Dan to Beersheba is about 140 miles. Now, Dan, we'll talk about this. We'll visit Dan. Dan shouldn't be the northernmost site in Israel, but it became that when the Danites, having been given a property, a possession, a portion down in the Sorek Valley near the coast, was convinced that God, Yahweh, who had just given them the conquest of the land, couldn't give them that area, and so they went and found Laish and settled up there. And so we think of all Israel. This phrase is used a number of times in Scripture. 1 Samuel 3, all Israel from Dan to Beersheba. knew that Samuel was appointed of God to be a prophet. So Dan, right at the foot of Mount Hermon, right here is Mount Hermon, and that's a mountain that it continues to the north and so on. But that's always considered the northernmost spot in Israel, and Beersheba the southernmost, simply because Beersheba is about as far south as you can. Let me say this, that as you go south or east in Israel, as you go south or east, the rain lessens. And so as you go south, you're making your way toward the Negev desert. And Beersheba is right on the cusp between the hill country of Judah and the Negev. And Beersheba is always regarded has always been regarded as the city which is the furthest, as far south as you have enough water to sustain a community. So Beersheba, and let me say this, and I'll undoubtedly make this point again when we're in Israel, but get it in your head that in antiquity, and not very far into antiquity, actually into the late 19th and early 20th century, most, especially in this part of the world, nations did not have physical boundaries. There weren't agreed upon lines. The extent of your domain, the extent of your kingdom was a function of the extent of the villages and sites that you controlled, and people were dependent upon you and were giving you their allegiance. And so it really is a function of physical control. And so at any rate, Beersheba was as far south. So if you take that, about 140 miles north to south and about 50 miles standard, it gets a little more broad as the coastline moves off to the west a little bit, but a very, very tiny land. And again, what's remarkable is that this tiny land is characterized by such remarkable divisions, and that's where we're going to go. So there are these 6 strips. Now, we've talked about 5 before, but we've added one here, and it's great. I mean, it makes all the sense in the world. Now, I want you to know these. We're going to travel these. The one that we're going to be the most negligent of is the Negev to the south, but the others we will travel rather carefully. Know them. You have the coastal plains, just that, the rolling sand dunes and so on. Beyond the coastal plains, you have the hill country. Now, to the south in the hill country, you have this region called the Shephelah, Piedmont, lowlands, foothills, where you have, given a different kind of limestone, you have rolling hills in this area, whereas you have very steep hills with V-shaped valleys in the central hills. So the Shephelah is only in the south. Again, we'll make much of this, but there is no Shephelah in the north. And the Shephelah becomes twice important, first of all, because it absorbs the rainwater coming out of the central hills, and thus this area to the south, the plain of Philistia, is not as swampy as the area to the north. The plain of Sharon to the north of Aphek, sitting right about here, is always been much swampier, more difficult to settle and maintain and so on, simply because it was there is no buffer between the hills and the coastal plains to the north. You have the valley of Jezreel here to the north with the Harod Valley. So I'm back to my strips. The coastal plains, the central hills bounded on the west between the coastal plain and the central hills by the Shephelah, but only in the south. And then you have this Jordan Rift. It's huge, deliberate, remarkable. I say deliberate. I mean, it was deliberate in God's part, but it defines the land in so many remarkable ways. Now, the strip that he's added here, and it makes a lot of sense, is the Jeshimon, or the wilderness. Remember that over here is desert, and that is to the east is the Arabian desert, and keeps doing that to me. Oh, it did to me worse. And you've got, for much of the year, you've got the hot, dry eastern winds blowing across the Dead Sea, and it just bakes this area to the west of the Dead Sea, and it becomes known as the wilderness or the Jeshimon. And we're going to spend a lot of time there Yeah, it's very, very important. I will tell you, but I'll say it here very quickly, that what makes this so remarkable is that on the one hand, the wilderness is so desolate, so difficult, so inhospitable, almost, and in many ways inaccessible. And so it's not easy to live there, but it's so close to the main. Here's Jerusalem, just to the south of it is Bethlehem and so on. And the wilderness is so close. So it was often a place where rebels or recluses or refugees, I just made an outline, would often repair to the wilderness. They could find a hideout there. So the wilderness becomes very important. This is where Jesus goes to be tempted, to fast for 40 days and then to be tempted. Now, this map is doing something that maybe I can introduce you to right now. We'll talk a lot about this, but this map, this, of course, is the Dead Sea, and it's representing the fact that the Dead Sea used to extend all the way down here. This dotted line area is the more shallow southern end of the Dead Sea, which is today drying up. It's almost disappearing. It's a great concern, and there are all sorts of plans and process to try and revive this area, because that area to the south is drying up, and as a result, the area along the wilderness here is suffering from sinkholes, huge sinkholes that are all of a sudden appearing, and to the highways are dropping into a hole and so on. But we'll talk more about that. And then to the east is the Transjordanian High, the Moabite Plateau, the area to the east, which we'll not visit today. It's Jordan, the land of Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. It's a friendly border, but we'll not cross over. A lot of people like to go over to visit Petra down here. Amman sits up about here. There's a very important city, the Decapolis, called Jerash up to the north, but we'll not do it. All right, so again, those are the strict strips. And again, it produces a significant measure of fragmentation. And here is again, the point here is that because you have, listen, I always say this, we lived in California for a time. We lived down in the LA area and so on. And on occasion, we would drive up to the mountains. And I always say, there's a reason people live in the mountains. When you just drive up into the mountains close by, less than a half-hour drive, oftentimes go up, and a bunch of us would go up on a Saturday morning on our motorcycles and have lunch have breakfast at a kind of backwoods eatery up there, and all the locals would come and had a big shelf, and every man had his, with all the, they were different sort of people. They were pleasant and so on, but the life they lived in the mountains was different, and that's exactly the case. You have all of these very distinct regions, distinct in geography, in topography, in culture, in the climate, in agriculture, and all that produces a very, very distinct culture. And to make that point, just rehearse the history of the Old Testament real quick, or the history of the Bible. You have the 12 tribes. When Joshua distributes the 12 tribes, they fight among themselves. Everyone is living unto himself. As a matter of fact, that whole period of the Judges, that is, you have the conquest and then the distribution of land at the end of Joshua, and then you have the period of the Judges. And the key word is every man did that which was right in his own eyes, because there was no king. It's not talking about the Smiths and the Jones. It's talking about the Judahites versus the Ephraimites versus the Benjamites versus the Zebulunites and so on. That because they were living in different portions and they developed different habits and so on. And then of course you have the divided monarchy. That is, even after they become 12 tribes and they enjoy the period of blessing and so on, and unity, if you don't mind, under David and under Solomon, but then very quickly they split up. They become, and in the days of Jesus, the Samaritans don't get along with the Jews in the south and Judea and the north and Galilee and so on. The Galileans don't appreciate the Judeans. They think they're well, it's more the other way. The Judeans don't appreciate the Galileans. They think they're sort of backwater hicks and so on. The Judeans are the sophisticated, white-collar, educated types and so on. So again, this land just gives itself, and even today, especially today, the different peoples who live on top of each other, but come from very different cultures, habits of mind, and so on, languages today. And it was the same in biblical times, that they developed a distinctive language. You could tell a Galilean by listening to him talk. speaking the same language to be sure, but as a Judean. So it always produced the problem of unity. And only during the days of David and Solomon was there really sustained oneness on the part of the country. And Todd makes the point, it's an interesting point. You compare that to Egypt, where they were really pretty much one people. There were various dynasties along the way, but those people were pretty much all living on the river, all basically the same culture and so on. And it's a remarkable dynamic. Now, quickly, this map right here. I like this map. It's twice in your study booklet that you'll be using. It's very helpful. I'm going to take just a minute and make my way. It's called, I'll call it the schematic. Notice that it has an eastern orientation. I don't know how valid this is, but we're told that in antiquity they always regarded the east. So we regard the north as sort of the orientation, the front, and they regarded the east. I don't know. I think it may have something to do with a map. It's better on a screen like this, but when it's laid on its side. But notice several elements here that are very helpful. Here is the coastal plain. And again, notice what's happening here. The plain to the south, this is the plain of Philistia. To the north is the plain of Sharon or Sharon. And the schematic here is trying to represent right here a swampy area, because to the south you have, and these are this little hatch mark, the Shephelah. This is the Shephelah, and it's this remarkable, it's Eocene limestone, and so the hills are quite undulating and rolling and open, whereas you get into the hill country and they're much steeper and so on. And this Shephelah becomes a buffer zone. I didn't finish that. It's twice important because, one, it absorbs the water that comes out of the hill country to the south, the hill country of Judah. So the coastal plain is much more, it's not nearly as swampy. That is the Philistine plain. And the other dynamic, and we'll spend a lot of time with this, is that if you're going to attack Jerusalem, and here sits Jerusalem right here in the hill country, if you're going to attack Jerusalem, you can't bring, especially armies from the east, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and so on. They cannot bring their army down the central, the ridge route. So their army has to come through the Valley of Jezreel, through the Megiddo Pass, down, and then attack from the west. And so the way you protect Jerusalem is to build buffer states. There's Jerusalem. You buffer cities guarding the passes that get you, not so much, I call it the valley ridge system that gets you up into the hill country. So this Shephelah is number two. It's important as water absorption area. And secondly, it's important as the buffer. So what do you think of it? The buffer zone for Jerusalem. You guard Jerusalem by guarding the ridge routes that bring you up from the west into the hill country to attack Jerusalem. So that's the Shephelah. And then now beyond the Shephelah, you have the hill country. And the hill country gives you the hill country of Judah to the south, basically between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean. So you have Judah to the south. Then to the north, you have the hill country of Ephraim, New Testament. This is Samaria. And then you have this right here, this body right there, that big chunk of land right there. Matter of fact, let me do this. The way it's represented here, basically this big chunk of land, that is Mount Carmel. And we've said before that Mount Carmel is the hill which defines the Jezreel Valley on the south, because here is that this is a schematic. It's all very, very different, carefully stylized. But this arrowhead-shaped valley is in point of fact, the Valley of Jezreel. And there, if that's an arrowhead, there is a shaft, handily enough, and that's the Valley of Harod, the Valley of Harod. So you have, and remember that the traffic is going to be funneled either around here and past Mount Tabor and into the Valley of Jezreel, or down here and up this valley and into the valley. I'm making a mess here, but the fact is that the international traffic coming east or north toward Egypt down here is going to be funneled into this valley. And when it is thus funneled into that valley, it's going to have to, because it wants to get down here to the Via Maris. It's going to make its way right down this way. And in order to do it, it's got to pass through one of these three valleys, and really pretty much one of these two valleys. This right here is the valley of Megiddo, and that's the primary, the fastest and most direct. This little shotgun is the valley of Yokneam, or in Hebrew, the J becomes a Y, Yokneam. This again is Megiddo. And then there is one other pass, and it makes its way into it comes out here, Dothan, and you can make your way either out to the coastal plain, and thus the Via Maris, or this pass will get you up onto the ridge route, which takes you down past Ebal, Gerizim, and Shechem, and all the way down here past the Central Benjamin Plateau, and just near Jerusalem, and down through Bethlehem, and then all the way down to Beersheba and Hebron and Beersheba. So the point is that this Mount Carmel is the plug. It's the great bottleneck on international traffic. And this schematic is designed to show you that once you get into this valley of Jezreel, you're going to have to come through probably one of these two passes, and thus, again, I say it, if you can control those two passes, you can monitor and even tax the international traffic, the caravan and military traffic. So again, coastal plains, the hill country, which includes this hugely important mountain, which is Mount Carmel. Then to the north of that, and by the way, from the valley of Jezreel and the Harod in Jesus' day, north is Galilee. Everything, once you get to this valley right here, you're in Galilee. And then you have, this is the area of lower Galilee, and this right here is upper. Now we'll talk about that, but upper Galilee is just rises up, very inaccessible, never been settled. But lower Galilee, this area right here, Jezreel Valley and north, all of this area is some of the most beautiful, fertile land on all of the earth. Josephus refers to it, at least one section of it, as the ambition of nature. He waxes ebullient about the crops and the foliage and the fruits, and it's really, it's a beautiful, beautiful area. And remember, in the Old Testament, this was Zebulun and Naphtali, and it doesn't enter the record. It's just part of the northern kingdom. But by the time you get to the New Testament, this area up to the north has been annexed. This area here, all of this area in here, in the New Testament, I'm saying now, is Samaria. And then, of course, down here is Judah to the south. But this area up here had been annexed just a couple hundred years before Christ by Alexander Jannaeus, one of the Hasmoneans, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jewish folk had moved up here because it was just much easier living. Again, it's easier to raise, the rabbis like to say, 10 sons in Galilee than it is to raise one vineyard in Judea in the New Testament. So by the time you get to the New Testament, Jesus is going to spend a great deal of time, 18 months up there. He's going to be raised in Galilee. As a matter of fact, talk about Judean Jews who migrate up to Galilee. Think about a family who had a daughter named Mary and was living in Nazareth, and another family who had a son named Joseph. They were all Bethlehemites. They were all Judeans, but somehow they had migrated for some reason up there, and now Joseph and Mary are living in Nazareth. That's where Jesus is going to be raised, of course. So this area up to the north, Galilee, is where so many tens of thousands of Jewish folk have relocated, settled up there, and therefore Jesus is going to spend a great deal of his ministry making the case for his messiahship up there to the north. All right, so beautiful rolling hills and so on. Now, on the other hand, to the east, you have this mammoth Jordan Rift, actually Syro-African from Syria, way up here to the north, all the way down to Central Africa. And this cleft in the earth, the Dead Sea, is already 1,300 feet below sea already. It's the lowest spot on Earth. I shouldn't say that way, but it's 1,300 feet below sea level on its surface, and it's 1,200 feet deep. The Sea of Galilee here is about, actually today they're saying because of the dropping, oh, be quiet. It's about 700 feet below sea level. This is the Jordan River snaking its way 60 miles from the Jordan to the Dead Sea. But because it meanders, so it's over 100 miles, some say close to 200. But at any rate, so that schematic is hugely helpful. It's just trying to lay out the various portions. These are transverse or cross valleys, beautiful rolling valleys. They're just stunning in Galilee, and then there are hills in between and so on. But even the hills are very tillable and so on, the sides of the hills. We'll see that. On the other hand, to the south here, I didn't talk about it, this is the Negev, and it's the very, very dry, basically desert. It's where only desert people live and so on. And then to the east is the Moabite Plateau, and this is the Old Testament designation. So it's Bashan up here to the north, and then Gilead to the west, to the east, Moab below that, Edom below that. The Ammonites sort of are roaming around in here, but they also are settled in this area, the Ammonites. So, all right, so much. You get to know that. And I'll tell you one other thing about this little map real quickly. I'm taking too much time. But what this map does is it gives you a lot of initials, but it gives you some words, but in large, most of the time, it just gives you initials. And it becomes kind of an opportunity to test how far you are along. So this right here, Im. What does Im stand for? It turns out it's going to be the hill of Moreh. But same thing here. You have this T. What is this T? I think my eyes aren't what they once were. But so each of these, here is a C. What is that? Well, that's Caesarea Maritima. Here's a J. What is that? Well, as it turns out, that's Joppa. So again, you ought to be able to, maybe here's a J, which is Jerusalem, and here's a B, which is Bethlehem. So it's just the way this map is constructed, work at getting to the place where you can identify by heart, just by looking at it, all of those places. All right, now I got to be quick. Here again, now this actually is the same slide we saw before, and I meant to take it out, so I'm just going to go past it. Here, I like what Todd has done here. He's taken this area where this is the satellite map, and it's regions and routes, and actually it's geographical regions as well as political. So you have some of the same thing: the coastal plains, the Sharon Plain. Here's Jaffa. Aphek is basically the division between them. The Negev to the south, the hill country of Judah, the Shephelah that we talked about. And then, of course, Samaria in the New Testament, Ephraim and Manasseh in the Old Testament. Here's the Jordan River Valley. Here's that Jezreel Valley with the Harod Valley. So you can take what we saw here, of course, is that very important Mount Carmel with its three passes, Yokneam and Megiddo and so on. But, so again, the Sea of Galilee with the Dead Sea, and then these areas to the east, Gilead and the Ammonites, and here are the four gorges, the Arnon River flowing in, and I'm not seeing all of them. You can trace them. I'm having trouble seeing here with my aged eyes, but and here again is the Lower Galilee, which is inhabitable and beautiful, and where somebody lived, as opposed to Lower Galilee. This area right here, we'll spend a whole day in this valley. To the north, here's the Sea of Galilee, and to the north is this very important area called the Hula Valley, and to the north, at the north end of that is Dan at the foot of Mount Hermon here. So again, you've seen all of this. This is a beautiful map. Now what Todd does here is he kind of lays out some of the regions. Here is Benjamin. Benjamin is a belt of land between Ephraim and Samaria to the north and Judea to the south. So here is, this is more a political Judea and Samaria. That was the area given in the New Testament, of course, to Pontius Pilate, but Benjamin is a belt, right? The tribal portion of Judah was to the south here, and the tribal portion of Ephraim was to the north, So in the Old Testament, Benjamin is that belt between Judah to the south and Ephraim to the north. Of course, the city of Jerusalem is just barely in Benjamin. It's just one valley into Benjamin. David chose it, Jebus as his city. We'll talk more about that. Here is that Shphelah that we talked about before, low rolling hills. This is the wilderness and the Negev. He's grouping that together, and well, he might, the wilderness and Negev. Negev to the south here, and wilderness alongside the Dead Sea. But they're very similar terrain, the plain of Sharon, and then Jezreel Valley with the Harod. The actual shaft of the arrow is formerly the Harod Valley, but it's all one valley to be sure. Galilee and the Golan way to the north, and then the Sea of Galilee. So again, all of that to say that this kind of blocks out the regions quickly. The climate as you go south, as you go east or south, it gets dry and hot. And he's referring to that as leeward, moving away from the sea. As you go west and or north, it becomes more moist and more pleasant and so on. West in this case being seaward as you move toward the sea. Now, this is interesting, real quickly, I'd spend one more time, but this is the average monthly rainfall, as it says there, and it's really kind of remarkable. There are two seasons. And they are the winter rainy season from October through April, May. So these of course are the rainy seasons. And then you have the summer dry season after the transition. And notice you get virtually no rain. I clipped this out of a newspaper a couple years ago, but in 2012, there was a rainstorm in in Galilee in August. And it made international news. It wasn't a particularly bad storm. It's just that rain in August just doesn't happen. And so it became a bit of a news story. And then, of course, you have the temperatures. Now, this is Jerusalem. And if you were there in August, you would think that this maybe is a little oversold, but because it can get hot. But the average temperature, and that's important because in Israel, there is such a fluctuation, such a variation in the course of one day. So it'll be very hot when the sun is out. When the sun goes down, it'll cool down remarkably. We were there in August. It was so hot. It was over 100 every day, it seemed like, just this last year. And we left the Rift happily enough, made our way up to Jerusalem. And the first time we were in Jerusalem, and we had been sweating and, all of us just enduring the horrible heat. And the first time we were in Jerusalem, we were going to go take a walk, and all the women went back and got sweaters to put on because it was cool. And so it really is remarkable. That was in August. It's going to be chilly when we're there in December. But Israel is a fairly moderate climate. The thing about what you got to remember about Israel, it's really important, is that it lies between the desert and the sea. The desert on the east, the sea on the west. And so it is both in terms of the course of the year and in terms of the course of a day, the weather can be so profoundly affected by those two realities. Now let me just finish with this, and I'll be quick. But Moses told Israel that the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with streams, with pools of water, with springs flowing. And it is. It's a well-watered land. That's a land where you have to depend upon the annual cycle for that water to appear. But it's a good land. And Israel makes much of the 7 species out of Deuteronomy 8. It's a land with wheat and barley. So there are grains, there are grasses, the hay and the barley and the wheat, vines where you grow your grapes that are orchard, and fig trees and pomegranates and olive oil and honey, whether it's honey from the bees, where there was a great deal, it still is, or honey from the dates. It's a refreshing land. He says it's a land where bread will not be scarce, and that's true. Now, we think of Israel as a land with very little tillable soil, but if Israel was obedient and if God sent the former and latter rains, there was sufficient land, especially up in Galilee, fruitful Galilee, to grow. Now, because they were so often disobedient, because the rain didn't come, then they were dependent upon Egypt and so on. and it's a land with where you can dig copper out of the hills and so on, which was that was an important resource in antiquity. It says, when you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord. Don't take credit for it yourself, for the good land. And Todd has given us here a picture of these remarkable, this is the way they would terrace the steep hillsides and then farm. All of these are olive trees, cash crop. And we'll make much of that. And the point to be made here in closing is that it's a kind of land, although it's a good land, it is totally dependent upon God's watch care. And so he says through both the climate, the cycle, and so on, and the agriculture of the land, God provides through rain to give you that grain, but he disciplines through lack of rain. And so man's response of faith is hugely important. And Todd is making the point here that God frames the land and shapes the land and frames the climate and so on to make the point that your work is not enough. Hard work doesn't guarantee success. And you're dependent upon God. And therefore, in this world, the teachment is that don't look to the world. Don't look to the terrain or the agriculture. Hope for that which is to come. And rejoice when you don't have enough. And you have this remarkable verse in Habakkuk as he closes, Habakkuk, who challenged God's governance of the moral universe and then was taught that the just shall live by faith and bowed the knee to that and writes a beautiful, beautiful psalm where he concludes in Habakkuk 3, though the fig tree doesn't bud, maybe there are no grapes on the vine, though the olive crop fails, those hillside crops, they don't come in, and we don't have much oil, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord and be joyful in God my Savior. So the land is very much an intimate part of God's the way God determined to deal with his covenant people. And we're going to make much of that as we go. All right, thank you.